Um, Hello. Today, I think I'm talking about books. Yes, talking about all the books that I've read this year. I read 30 books in total over the course of the year, and I would like to spend some time reviewing all of them. I'm just gonna grab my list of books. Okay. First up on the list is Possession by A.S Byatt. One of my friends gave this to me for Christmas last year, and it was the first book that I finished reading in 2022. I was really excited to get this book because my friend who gave it to me left like a bunch of small annotations and underlines and highlights throughout the whole book, and so it was just a fun read because of that. The book itself, though, is a bit melodramatic, overly poetic, not necessarily in a bad way. It's a very physically draining book to get through just because it's kind of a slog. But the story is pretty good if you're in the right mood and you have the right music to go with it. And yeah, so Possession by A.S Byatt, I give a 4 out of 5 stars. The next book on the list is Shadow of the Hegemon by Orson Scott Card. You can see I made a big switch as far as genres go after I read Possession. This is the second book in like the alternate series of the Ender's Game books. So there's the main Ender's Game books, which is Ender's Game, Speaker for the Dead, Xenocide, I think is the third one. And then there's the alternate series, which is Ender's Shadow, and then this is the next one, which follows the events on Earth after the events of Ender's Game. For me personally, I mean, it's a good book. I enjoyed it a lot, but it does reveal, I think, some of the problems with Orson Scott Card's world building and character development skills, because his narrative starts to fall apart and seem a bit unrealistic. Not that it wasn't already unrealistic, but it doesn't hold up as well as the other books for me. So I give this a 4 out of 5 as well also. The next book I read was Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. Honestly, I don't remember that much from this book. I remember that I liked Sun Also Rises more. That's the main thing that I remember from reading this. Although the ending of this book, where there's like the scene with the boat and they go up the lake and then they live in Switzerland for a while, I liked that part. I thought it was nice. I won't spoil the ending, but the ending kind of ruined that nice part. And yeah, so I give it a 5 out of 5 because I remember liking it, but I don't remember that much of what happens in it. Okay, next book. Next book is Catcher in the Rye by J.D Salinger. I actually read this twice this year. I read it once just because I wanted to read it, and then I had to read it a second time for my English class, which made writing any essays that I had to write for this book very easy, which was nice. This is a very complicated book for me because I hate almost everyone and everything about it, but it's also a really great book. I hate the characters, I hate the dialogue, I don't like the message really. It seems kind of cheap, but I do really like the book still, somehow. One of my friends who had to read this also in English class with me, she told me that Catcher in the Rye is a Sally Rooney book for teenage boys, which I think is a pretty good analogy. It's depressing and angsty, and some parts, especially at the end, I actually had to like skip through because it was just a bit too much for me. But I think it is a hopeful book, more or less, just because as a reader you come away feeling pretty good about yourself and feeling like, okay, well, you know, at least I'm not Holden Caulfield. And I think Mark David Chapman got the message of this book very wrong. Okay, the next book I read is The Master and the Margarita. The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. This book, the cover of this book really sells it for me. I mean, I saw one of my friends reading this and I just thought, oh my gosh, I need that book right now. And it's a lot of fun. It's kind of a parody of 1930s Stalinist Soviet Union, because the author, Mikhail Bulgakov, couldn't write about what he actually wanted to write about during this time period, and so he wrote this sort of like, I don't even know how to describe it. It's so weird. So many strange things happen. But I will describe the opening sequence, which is what got me hooked, and maybe you as well. So the book starts with these two Russian guys walking through a park in 1930s Stalinist Soviet Union. And they're discussing how religion sucks and Jesus Christ isn't actually the Son of God, and, you know, other anti-religious communist stuff. And they're talking about this, and they're both professors. And then this other guy, this foreigner, they think he's German or something, I think. He comes up to them and he's like, oh my gosh, you guys don't believe in God? That's so quirky cool of you, because you're Soviet Union 1930s Stalinist Russia people. And they're like, yeah, we don't believe in God. What's it to you? And he's like, and then he walks with them for a while, and he tells them this like weird story about something in the Bible. And then they're like, well, how do you know that it happened like that? You know, like he tells this story as if telling the story is proof that everything in the Bible happened. And then they're like, well, how do you know that any of that happened? And the guy like leans in really close, and he's like, because I was there. And they're like, what are you talking about? And then he goes, you guys said you don't believe in God, but do you believe in the devil? And then they're like, no, that's really dumb. And then it is revealed that this man, this foreigner from Germany, is in fact the devil. And he begins by decapitating one of the professors with a train, and then goes off through Moscow to do all this other crazy stuff. And it's so good. I loved it so much. So this book, Master and Margarita, also got a 5 out of 5. One of my favorites from this year. Honestly, just for the opening scene and the cover alone. The next book is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Another good cover, but that didn't sell it for me this time. Let's see. So, Great Gatsby. Another sort of angsty, confusing. It's pretty short, but it didn't feel that way when reading it. I got through it pretty quickly, but it felt like a slog in some parts, and it develops kind of slowly, and I didn't really understand what happened until I watched the movie afterwards, but maybe that's just me. Yeah, there's honestly not that much to say about it, other than it's a classic, and it's good, I guess, but I didn't particularly enjoy it that much. So I give this a 3 out of 5. The next book I read was Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. What can I say about this book? It took a long time to get through. It's very tedious, very boring, excruciatingly painful with nostalgia and despair at certain points. But I still liked it. I didn't like it as much as To the Lighthouse, which I read last year. To the Lighthouse, I think, is a much better book, even though it's less concise, I guess, because everything in this book takes place over the course of like one day, whereas To the Lighthouse is much more confusing to follow. But I don't know, this just didn't do it for me as much as To the Lighthouse did. But I gave it a 3 out of 5. The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. This was one of my favorite books of all time. I try to reread it every year, and this I think is like my 4th year reading it. I definitely plan on rereading it again next year. I had a very long journey just to be able to read this. I first attempted to read it in 5th grade, and I didn't get past like the 3rd chapter. And then I tried reading it again in 6th grade. I got through maybe the 4th chapter. And then in like 8th or 9th grade, I was finally like, okay, I'm gonna read this. And I bought the audiobook, and I listened to the audiobook, and I read it in like 2 days with the audiobook. It's just such a whimsical, happy story. I think modern fantasy has a really big problem right now where every single fantasy book, the stakes are so high. It's like there's so many hero needs to save the world or else world will end books. And this is not that. Like, I guess in like Lord of the Rings and the other stuff, they make the events of The Hobbit more important. But within the book itself, like, it's not that important at all. It's just some dwarves and a hobbit with a wizard going on a quest to kill a dragon. Like, the stakes are not world-ending, world-saving level. It's very comfortable, and yeah, I love it a lot. This is a 6 out of 5 for me, which I'll explain more later, but it doesn't count as my favorite book from this year because it's a reread. Making our way down the shelf here. The next book is Mr. Fox by Helen Oyeyemi. I talked about this book in one of my videos from earlier this year. I think it was like How Reading Affects Writing, that one. And I described it at the time as like a painting where it starts off really slow and confusing and you don't know what anything is. And then when it finishes and you get to zoom out, it's like, wow, that is art. And I still agree with that. There's some things in here after some time has passed where I look back on it and I say, well, it's not as well done as I originally thought, but I still really love this book and I had an amazing time reading it. And let's see. Yeah, I gave it a 5 out of 5 and I still do. Next book is Crossings by Alex Landragin. Let's see, what is there to say about this? It's a really interesting concept. The basic gist of this book is like, you can either read it straight through, in which case it'll be like 3 different stories, or you can read it in like the special reading order and it'll like tell you like when you get to page 30, it'll be like go to page 296 and then you read that and then it gets to the end of that. It's like go to page 111. And I read it that way. I didn't read it straight through. I read it the mismatched way and I liked it a lot. I think the concept is really well executed. The story is pretty good, but overall it's kind of forgettable. Like, when I was like making my list of all the books that I read this year, I didn't even remember that this was on the list until I found it on the shelf. But yeah, I give this, I wrote 3 out of 5, but I think I'll give this a 4 out of 5. It was pretty good. All right, another Helen Oyeyemi book. This one is Gingerbread. One of my friends saw that I was reading Mr. Fox, and she said that I should read this one too. And I did, and it's not as good. This one is just so much more confusing. Maybe I'm just too dumb for it. Like, I really couldn't figure out what was happening, even up until the end. And then it wasn't until afterwards where I was like, okay, I think I get it now. But yeah, it just wasn't as good. Although, again, amazing cover. Honestly, I would buy this book just to have it in my house. And yeah, so 3 out of 5 for Gingerbread. It was worth reading, but it wasn't that amazing. All right, the next book that I read is Volume 2 of the Autobiography of Bertrand Russell. This might seem like an unusual choice, but I got this as a gift, and I was like, what the hell? Most of it looks like a huge book, but it's really not. Most of this is just like letters that he wrote to people that they've put in the book. And so I skipped most of those, although I'm sure there's some interesting stuff in there. But I just read like his own thoughts and stuff, which didn't take that long. Very interesting guy. I didn't know anything about him until I read this book. And he met Albert Einstein. He was invited to dinner by Sun Yat-sen. He lived in a very interesting time period. Like, he was born in the 1870s, and so his grandfather was a member of the British Parliament, met Bismarck and all of the 19th century European imperialists, and then he kind of lived his life through the transition towards the waning years of like imperialism and into the atomic age. I think he died in the 60s or 70s. But yeah, so this was just really interesting, and he was a very interesting guy, and this book will come back later on. What did I give it? I think a 4 out of 5. No, 3 out of 5. I guess, I don't know, 3, 4, whatever. It was good. I liked it. Okay, the next book. This was the first book that I read over summer. I bought this copy in Rome when I went to Europe, and it is Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates. I really liked this book. It takes place in the 1950s. It follows a couple who have just like bought their first house together, and they're super happy, and then they're super not happy, and then they're super happy again. I won't spoil it, but it's an emotional roller coaster. It's kind of depressing, kind of sad, very 50s aesthetic. I liked that. And again, I bought it because the cover is spectacular. So, yeah. All right, next book. You'll notice a theme here that I buy all these books because they have nice covers, and I don't regret that. I judge every book by its cover, and it's the best way to shop for books, because then along with amazing books, you get art just for your house. Okay, the next book I read was Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle, Zevin. This book was really good. This is actually, I think, one of the only like recent releases I read. I guess no, it's not the only one, but one of the few recent releases that I read this year. And I really liked it. Originally, when I first read it, I gave it a 6 out of 5. I thought this might be the best book that I've read this year. And the reason for this is one particular scene that takes up an entire chapter, or maybe it might even be more than one chapter. But anyway, I won't tell you what the scene is, but there's one scene in here that is so gut-wrenchingly powerful that I originally thought it might be the best book I read this year. Since then, I've changed my mind, but it is still absolutely worth reading, even just for that one scene. The next book I read is The World of Yesterday by Stefan Zweig. Now, you might already be able to tell just from the sheer number of post-its that I've put in here that I really liked this book. This book inspired Wes Anderson's Grand Budapest Hotel, which is my favorite movie, and the book might be even better than the movie. It's not like directly inspired. It's just kind of in the same style as that movie, and so it's not like there's no character named Mr. Gustav. It's nothing like that. It's just the style, which is such a unique style that Stefan Zweig has. And I haven't read very much of his other stuff. I have a collection of his short stories up there that I've read a few of. It just does, they haven't done it for me the same way that this book did. This is also sort of autobiographical. It follows Stefan Zweig's life from when he was born in the 1880s in Vienna, all the way up to the outbreak of World War II. And it is one of the most powerful books I've ever read. And I think it is my favorite book of this year. If you haven't seen it already, I wrote an essay based on this book and the autobiography of Bertrand Russell. The video's not that good, but the essay is really good. Yeah, this was my 6 out of 5 book for the year, which I should explain now. Basically, the way that I score books every year is every year I give one book 6 out of 5 stars, and that is like my favorite book of the year. And for me, last year, well, I already mentioned how a couple years ago it was The Hobbit, which is why it still has a 6 out of 5 score, even though it's a reread. But this is the only book this year that I read that earned 6 out of 5, and so it is my favorite book from this year. Crossing to Safety by Wallace Stegner. I read this book while listening to Can I Call You Tonight, which is one of my favorite songs from this year. I listened to that song 100-something times while reading this book. And so if you want to have literally the same experience reading it that I had, you should listen to that song. This is just such an incredible book. It's so hopeful and yet also sad. I think the books that I liked most this year are the books in which the characters are super realistic and feel so complete, flawed certainly, but also just whole people. And this book certainly achieves that. And it sort of chronicles the lives of these two couples as they become friends during the Great Depression and then lose touch and then come back again, and everything in between that happens to them. It's one of the... I'll talk about this more later with another book that I read, but it gave me a new way of looking at America, which I'm very appreciative of, and I liked its perspective on my country a lot. The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro. It also deals with like relationships and marriage, and the people in this book also feel really real, even though it's told in a much more whimsical sort of storybook way. But I really liked this book a lot because of the way that the narrative unfolds itself. It's almost like a fairy tale told backwards, because most fairy tales start with quite a bit of exposition. Like you figure out who the characters are, where they come from, what they want, and then things go wrong, and then it resolves itself. But this book starts with things that are unresolved, and you have to figure out who the characters are and what they want and where they come from along the way, and the characters themselves have to figure that out also. And so yeah, I gave this a 5 out of 5. The next book that I read was 1984. Animal Farm is also in this book, but I haven't read that for a couple of years. I read 1984 because my school was doing a performance of it as a play last in the fall, and so I wanted to read it before the play came out, and I enjoyed it. I mean, I can understand after having read it why it's so popular and relevant today, but at the same time, like, the dialogue is really bad. The story is kind of confusing. There's several things that don't really make sense. But I think the reason that I'm so easily able to like see those problems with the book is because it has been so overdone and overused in popular culture since it came out, whereas most of these other books are not very well known in popular culture. So I think this book's problems stem from its popularity and less from its actual content. Not that the problems don't exist, but they wouldn't be as noticeable if it wasn't such a popular book. Yeah, I gave this a 3 out of 5 just because of the terrible dialogue. All right, the next book that I read this year was Speaker for the Dead, another Orson Scott Card book. This was also a reread. Last year, 2021, this was my favorite book of the year. I gave it a 6 out of 5. I did so because, again, of how real the characters felt, but I hesitate to say that just because they felt real in a very different way from like the characters in Crossing to Safety, because the characters in this book are not complete, but they progress in a natural way, I suppose, and the communication between characters feels complete. Really, this book taught me the power of like human communication and how hard it can be, but how powerful it is when done right. I also really like the world of this book, all of the different galactic human colonies that interact via this faster than light communication technology called the Ansible. The whole premise, I think, is really compelling. But again, I feel like Orson Scott Card, his ability to imagine these worlds in a realistic way is hindered by so many factors. And one of the biggest ones that stood out to me is religion, because in this futuristic world, they've discovered an alien race, and they want to make sure that humans don't accidentally kill it. And so they just sort of set up a little colony on the outskirts of this town, on the outskirts of a village of this alien race. And then, but the unrealistic part for me was that they gave the license, the colonizing license for this alien planet to the Catholic Church, which is a bad idea for a lot of reasons. And I feel like the scientific community 3,000 years from now would be just as uncomfortable with that as we would be now. There's a lot of other problems that I could go into, but overall, after rereading this, I definitely noticed the faults more than I noticed the successes of this book. And so it still gets a 6 out of 5 because the score stays the same from last year, but I don't love it as much as I used to. And then I read The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. There's not that much to say about this book. I read Circe last year, and I think I liked that one more just because I found the characters more compelling and the story more interesting. I really liked Circe's Island, but that's a completely different book. But yeah, this book is just a really good love story. I don't know what else to say about it. It's well written, the characters are great, the story's good. I gave it a 5 out of 5, but there's not that much to say other than it's worth reading. It's a good book. The next book that I read is actually my lowest rated book for this year, which is Foundation by Isaac Asimov. There's so many things that this book has going for it. Like, I think conceptually it's really interesting, but the execution of that concept is so bad. The basic gist of this book is that there's this, in the future, I think it's like 12,000 years from now or whatever, humanity has colonized the whole galaxy, and there's this big galactic empire that's ruling everything. And it's sort of reminiscent of like ancient Rome, where it's like the government is okay but super corrupt and whatever. Anyway, like this mathematician, statistician guy, like is able to use really complicated math and like prediction stuff to figure out that the empire is going to collapse in like a couple hundred years from when he lives. And so he wants to preserve human knowledge for the, you know, thousands of years, the dark ages basically that's going to set in after the empire falls. And so he creates this organization that is dedicated to like preserving human knowledge. And that is a great concept, but it is so poorly executed. The dialogue is somehow even worse than George Orwell's dialogue. The pacing is so off. Like sometimes an entire century will go by in just a couple pages. Like you won't, and other times they'll spend way too much time talking about the intricacies of this like one insignificant government or people, and you're like, oh, I need to pay attention to this because it'll probably come back later, and then it doesn't. I mean, there's many sequels, so maybe some stuff comes back in the sequels, but reading this was just wholly unsatisfying, and I gave this a 2 out of 5. Not great. All right, we're getting close to the end here now. The next book I read was Everything Sad is Untrue by Daniel Nayeri. This is another recent release. I think also that this is a new publishing company that made this. That's what I heard anyway. Which I would like to just briefly shout out this publishing company, because this book is really well made. The physical book, it's very well bound. So many hardcover books nowadays just fall apart. The glue comes out, or the pages fall out, or the cover isn't put on very well, and it doesn't stay open flat. This is just a very well made book. You can tell. It's wonderful. So yeah, the book itself is great. The story is good. I enjoyed the structure of how this book is written a lot. It's written in a very unique way. Like you're sort of in the head of the author as he's telling it, rather than sitting with him being told the story. And I thought that was really neat. Okay, the next book is The Magicians by Lev Grossman. This is a horrible, horrible book. The premise is dumb and unoriginal. The story sucks. The characters all suck. The ending is probably one of the worst endings of any book I've ever read, but it's still a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to read, even despite all of that. Yeah, I gave it a 3 out of 5, which that puts it on par with Gingerbread, which it's not. It is definitely worse than Gingerbread, but yeah, I liked reading it, but it's not a good book. I don't recommend it. Next book is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. I watched the play, the Broadway production of this a couple months ago, and I thought, well, that was pretty good. I should read the book. And then I did, and the book is pretty good. I feel like this is such a culturally relevant book that there isn't that much that I can say about it that hasn't already been said. But yeah, I liked it. I think, yeah, I gave it a 4 out of 5. Good book. Second to last book that I read this year is The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. One of my friends begged me for months and months to read this because it's one of her favorite books of all time. And I finally did. And it's pretty good. I think Michiko Kakutani from the New York Times put it best when they said it's an indelible portrait of loss and grief. It's better than I could have said it. It's really sad. It kind of slows down a bit more than I would have liked in certain places, but overall, great book. Recommend it. 4 out of 5. All right, the last book that I read this year was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Betty Smith. This is another one of my favorite books that I've read this year. It's definitely on the level of Crossing to Safety and Tomorrow, and Mr. Fox. It's just a really happy book, even though it deals with so many issues like poverty and discrimination, just like the awfulness of New York City in the early 1900s. It's just so hopeful, even though there's so much loss and grief and pain throughout. And much like Crossing to Safety, it painted a really unique and interesting portrait of the United States at this time period that I really appreciated and I thought was really compelling. So yeah, I highly recommend. It's quite long, but it doesn't feel very long. It's an absolute delight to go through. And yeah, I give it a 5 out of 5. So yeah, that concludes all the books that I've read this year. I hope you enjoyed. I will have, I don't know if I'm gonna put links to all these books in the description, but I'll definitely at least write the names so you can look them up yourself and buy them if you want. And yeah, so thank you so much for watching. I'd love to hear what books you've read this year that you've really liked. What is your 6 out of 5 book? I might read it, probably won't, but you never know. Anyway, so thank you so much for watching.